Thank you to each of you for tuning in to this mental health focus of Bible study. I want to reiterate that this mental health focus of Bible study is for informational purposes only and is not to diagnose or treat any mental health conditions for the purpose of this video. Turn with me to the book of Psalms 13, 1 through 2. That's Psalms 13, 1 through 2, and Psalm 6, verse 6. Psalms 13, 1 through 2. And Psalm 6, verse 6. Psalms 13, 1 through 2 reads, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart?" Reading from the NIV, Psalm 6, verse 6 reads, "I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail." A popular show many people have watched, known most commonly to the world, named Grey's Anatomy, just recently featured the last speech, the final verbal words of Eric Dane, who played the character Dr. Mark Sloan on the show known to many as Grey's Anatomy. Upon the death of one of the stars of the show, Eric Dane, who played Dr. Mark Sloan, otherwise known as Dr. McDreamy, was a final verbal letter which aired on Netflix, broadcasting his last words to his daughter. What does Grey's Anatomy mean? The title. The show Grey's Anatomy was more than just a name whose title was repurposed by the show to include a focus on the personal lives and relationships of its characters. Grey's Anatomy was seemingly a play on words. Grey's Anatomy was formerly known as a book dedicated to medical terminology, a book that referred to how to handle trauma in the field where the word gray often symbolizes the color gray as encompassing a visual change in perception, which can make the world seem gray, no longer black or white, or washed out to someone experiencing a depressive episode. Psychologically symbolizing emotional numbness, feelings of being dispassionate, empty, filled with grief, fatigue, and lack of motivation. To anyone who watched the show or can imagine being on top of the world, the letter spoke of a contrast, as if two different people to some. There we see a man appearing to be okay with everything seemingly going for him by societal standards. Yet, he was a man who suddenly found himself outside of the limelight, outside of public view, outside of what the public facade would see, a man who suddenly felt weakened in his anatomy when attempted to swim in water. A life here in contrast. Eric Dane, who seemingly had all that the world could offer to others, now found himself in a situation that wasn't exactly the same as the character he played. Inside, he was not okay. He developed a debilitating condition despite living a life most anyone would envy, where anyone would want to trade places, to have his life, to have his friends, to have his career. But if they only knew what was to come, the darkness of the diagnosis and the will reportedly to be able to deal with the hand that life had dealt, there was a pain on the inside that no one could see. He would receive a life-changing diagnosis and later died of ALS as the world was graced with his final words. An ironic contrast exists in how Eric Dane played alongside the character Mark with the last name of Shepard, whose nickname Dr. McDreamy is based upon a word that beckons for us to dream, to hope, and references a state of being in REM mode, where the mind is very much at rest, but very much asleep, very much able to think, and very much able to dream. How many times is who we are and the way that we live contrast a life of dreaminess, euphoria, a place of hope and dreams where we stand face to face with the persona of ourselves that feels pain. Be reminded of the place that we're supposed to shepherd, to lead, but instead feeling somewhat paralyzed by pain. I'm not sure of how many of us would have ever imagined a once secret pain that lay deep within his nerves versus the shattered public perception. Pain that was once secret became known, and the pain that led to dark days of his life and fighting through what others could not see. That was the pain hidden inside his nerves, his body, his anatomy, and at times, his great mind. The theme for today's Bible study lesson today is the color of our grade anatomy. Well, I'm not a fan of Grey's Anatomy. I am in admiration of the words of the real-life character Eric Dane, who wanted his last words to foster a drive to appreciate life and foster hope, one of the anecdotes of depression. When we look at Psalms chapter 13, verses 1 through 2, we see David ask, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever?" We see the wonderment of God's timing as David feels abandoned, as if asking for mercy. We see three things here. We see triangulation between David, God, and triumphing over his problem. We see David's sense of asking, questioning God. It is here that we see openness. It is apparent that if David was asking how long, there was also hope that God would eventually show himself in the situation, in the fight, in the issue between David and his thoughts. For the Christian, our very existence is based upon the fundamentals of faith, where we are taught to always have hope, but hope through the grayness, through the dark times, through the despair, and even questioning through the tears can feel challenged. In a world where some might have learned or even felt challenged to admit that feelings of sadness, confusion, grief, and unhappiness would make us feel less holy, less grateful, less spiritual. The darkness, the hurt, the feelings of loss of hope is kept inside. Yet we must know that God not only understands, He gave us scriptures that speak about depression for the Christian. This says to you, it says to me, it says to every one of us that there is hope. Through the lens of the Bible, we see that just like anyone today, depression is real for others, no matter how rich, no matter how seemingly poor, no matter how big, no matter how seemingly small to others, no matter who they are, just as much as it is for the Christian. It is here in these passages of passage of 13, Psalms 13, 1 through 2, that we meet David, and is often where we meet the Christian, secretly. David is a man who is now downtrodden, depressed, and in grief. It is here that we meet depression. David was known for many things. He was a man who was known as one of the most skilled fighters, a shepherd, which is a leader, and a king. But here in this passage, we see David on the inside, his sorrow, and the side of life which is now marred with despair, questioning God, and with sleeplessness. Sleeplessness, which is now characterized as one of the symptoms of depression, an inability to sleep. And for some, it may be sleeping too much. Remaining here in the book of Psalms, we see David was no longer visibly the same king to some, but only in perception and reading his symptoms and how he presents to you and I. He was still the same person. He was still the same fighter. But this fight was against the battlefield of his great mind. And I believe that maybe some of you. Psalm 6 verse 6 states, "I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with tears. All night," he cried. David, the same fighter, the same king, the same shepherd, was crying in what the Bible stated as groaning. Groaning, defined in the Greek, as an audible, outspoken sign of distress. It was not silent. It could not only be heard, it was made unto God. Here, David had all the classic signs of depressions. Well, not all, but David had classic signs of depression, sleeplessness, crying. He was tired, worn out. Are you tired? David states in Psalm 6, verse 6, I am weary in my groaning. His sorrow, he states, was not just for a moment, but he mentions all night he makes his bed swim with tears. Travel with me over to the book of Romans 8:26. That's Romans 8, verses 26. Also reading from the NIV, which states, in the same way, the Spirit, notice the capital S, meaning refers to God in this passage, helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself, capital S and capital H, meaning we're talking about God here, means He intercedes for us with wordless groans, meaning sometimes we can't get it out. We cry, we feel, but sometimes there are not words to contain all that is going on inside. In examining the text, we read that such groanings are also defined as being too deep for words, inexpressible. Yet, as Christ made intercession for us in our weakness, He refers to His own very groanings, Christ's own very groanings, which means they are also shared by God. How many of you may be experiencing tearfulness, crying, grief, or sorrow? Tears, according to science, is aware of our body's anatomy to force neurons in our brains to involve nonverbal emotional vocalizations to cry out in a process that provokes our glands of our human anatomy to deal with our sensory nerves that feel pain to respond by regulating, balancing our neurotransmitters in order to relieve the pain. This process attempts to reconcile our nervous system and our heart to rest collectively in dealing with the stressor. This is why people often feel better when they cry. Even science supports getting it out and not keeping it inside. We're meant to cry out. We're meant to regulate as our own bodies, our anatomy forces itself to seek balance. What did David do? A fighter in every sense in the battle of his mind. And how is that similar to God in reconciling feelings of grief? David states all night he drenched himself with tears. We groan. We feel internally, inwardly, seeking to let it out, which means in the Greek stanza to sigh in distress. We can reconcile our feelings with God, who also groans and intercedes on our behalf. Let's refer back to Psalms 13, 1 through 2, where we see that David continues to ask, how long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? Sorrow, grief, pain, anguish. David cried out. He questioned. He allowed the release. He no longer kept it inside. He began to wrestle with his thoughts and the negative aspect of his mind, a portion of his great anatomy. As with David, we see as humans in our very own anatomy, we have an internal desire for normalcy, balance, and reconciliation. What does that mean to you? What side of you exists that stands between happiness and pain? The fighter versus the tears. David goes on in verse 8 through 9 of chapter 6 of the book of Psalms, and he speaks of his eyes wasting away as the result of grief. The text reads, my eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of my foes. For many, the issue being faced might not be a person. It may be life itself. It may be the economy, concerns of war, actual war, politics, health and or relationships. David says, as he continues, "Away from me, all of you who do evil, for the Lord has heard my weeping. The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord has accepted my prayer." The Lord accepts my prayer. David recognized that God not only heard, but he used the word accepts his prayers, which means means God recognized, to validate as real, which is one of the most significant portions of allowing someone to vent in the mental health field, to understand and to validate someone's feelings as real. We see David's reconciliation came once he pinpointed his trauma. He cried out to God to relieve his pain that he knew only God will be able to soothe, and he trusted God for his healing. If God thought enough of you back then to have a fighter named David, a king, a shepherd, and a man prolific enough to write the longest book in the Bible, the Psalms, which also references depression, fight this battle first. He knew, God knew, this day would come where the Christian would now have to fight against the battlefield of their grade mind. Trauma centers designed to triage most often asked a question by the person trained to render care, which is based on how does it feel, where does it hurt, and where does it hurt the most. On a scale of 1 through 10, they ask, how bad does it feel? How did you handle the diagnosis, the hurt, the grief, or how do you handle the diagnosis, the hurt, and the grief in the lens of God? How do we color the mind in a world that has grayed your anatomy? It is through the word, through the example, and through the story of David that we see how. As David is the writer of the book of Psalms, whose symptoms are consistent with depression, let me remind you that God's word in Psalms 23 verse 4 states that even in the darkest valley, God is a present comfort. How does this relate to the letter of Eric Dane, and how does this tie into David, you ask? The letter spoke of a life in contrast, hidden in the paradox of the surface of what lies within. One of pain and one of joy, where standing on the promises of God exists in the absence of what a person is seeing and feeling. Eric Dane, the Grey's Anatomy star, went on to make several points in his last words, released after his death. Points that parallel David's time on earth and the message he left for the believer. While I would never preach anyone's message other than the Lord himself, I want to point out the message and how it parallels with David, and I have a feeling that it parallels with you. The letter starts, I tried, but I stumbled. I stumbled, but I tried. Overall, we had a blast, didn't we? I stumbled, but I tried, it reads. David was known for his infamous story of adultery, often labeled David and Bathsheba. He didn't always get it right, but he tried. And just as much as Eric Dane reflected, just as much as the many accounts of David's that are too rich to include in this one message, he was honest with God. He told God about his frustrations. Similar to David, a man who was known for his rebellion, fighting and even adultery, independently of Eric Dane, but consistent with the character Mark Sloan in Grey's Anatomy. He spoke of his life being full of regrets. He relieved himself of the shame and the guilt of things that happened and didn't happen. He credited himself for the attempt, the try, the desire to succeed. Note he shifted his focus from the bad to the good times. Overall, we had a blast, didn't we? He recalled that his previous days were like heaven. He shifted his focus to the good times, the happy times. He went on to state, for years I wandered off mentally, lost in my head for large chunks of time, wallowing in worrying and self-pity, shame and doubt. And I replayed decisions. I second-guessed myself. I should have done this, and I never should have done that. Here you see a form of what psychology calls ruminating, defined simply as repetitive self-talk, which the field of mental health attributes to focusing on negative, gray emotions. The first point of his message was to live in the now. There exists the contrast. In reconciling his past, we see where things are now versus Eric Dane's message, which informs the listener to live in the moment, to live in the current times, to embrace the now. If we recall Psalms 8 through 9, we'll remember that David began to focus on knowing God forgave him. He also lived in that moment. David said, "The Lord has heard my weeping. He accepts my prayer." He encouraged the listener to live in the here and the now. Eric Dane's letter, Though Not the Bible, parallels the messianic theme of forgiveness of self. He beckons the listener to enjoy the now, to focus on whence we came, and to forget about those things that are behind us. I hope I haven't lost anybody in the comparison. Find yourself, and if necessarily, forgive God for what happened and what didn't happen. The letter goes on to say, live in the moment, stating the present is all you have. To treasure every moment, reflecting on the past already being behind us. No more, he says. He goes on to say that it's forced to live in the present, but he doesn't want to live anywhere else, in fostering hope for the listener. Hope, being a vastly known component, is one of the antidotes for overcoming depression. He finished by saying the past contains regrets and the future remains unknown. So you have to live now. Today is your no more. If we recall the passage of Psalms in verse 8 through 9, we will see how David began to focus on knowing that God forgave him. He stated, "The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer." There exists acceptance and reconciliation with God. The balance. He lived in the here and now and moving past the guilt and the shame. A shame no more. Eric Dane's second point was to fall in love with something. Not necessarily a person, but to find your passion. A key component to mental health exists within the social construct of a human's need to feel a sense of value and meaning. A job with meaning, a hobby, a passion, something that provides value, the actor stated. Find something that excites you. Find your path. Find your purpose. Beckon it to dream. Then go for it. Really, really go for it, the author says. Not without regard for others, but also not without apologetics, as you owe it to yourself to be happy. David obeyed God. He pursued passions. He cried, and he also fought for those he loved. What excites you? What thing deep inside makes you want to get up in the morning? Not to define you, but what really excites you? For some, it is switching jobs or changing careers. For others, it is releasing themselves of certain strongholds in order to find happiness. There is a release when we allow ourselves to love, and a tension when we allow ourselves to hate. Find something you love, find your passion, find God, love something, love others, love yourself. The letter goes on to say, find your passion and love it passionately. What is your passion? David fell in love with God while still being a man of many passions. He was a leader and a shepherd who loved. He loved his people. He loved the people in his environment. He loved the people of Israel. Throughout the highs and lows of his psyche, David's passion was to pursue God's presence in the worship. Despite falling short, David still loved God's law. The letter also encouraged the listener to show up for that love. David showed up for God, and God showed up for him through each high and low, and was named a man after God's own heart. There was a reference to also choose your friends wisely, referencing thankfulness for the times we have now, the ability to enjoy games, the things that did no longer cost, time with people, time with oneself, time with the Lord. Find your people, he said, and allow them to find you. Once found, really give yourself to love. Give yourself to God's love. David gave himself to the Lord. The Grey's Anatomy star goes on to say, the best of them will give the love back to you. No judgment, no conditions, no questions asked. There is a God who can meet that expectation and love at all times. David gave himself to the Lord in Psalm 6, and the Lord restored his mental health, his confidence, his strength, stating, the Lord has heard my cry. He has accepted his cry. Delight yourself in the law of the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desire. Peace, not as the world, not as this letter per se, not as anyone else can, but in a way that only God can. Psychiatry supports that healthy social constructs and positive environments contributes to a person's mental health. My question to you is, how is your environment? Does it nurture or does it trigger gray emotions? If it isn't loving, how can you bring love into it? A picture, a souvenir of a good time? How can you create it and focus on the good times? If there isn't anything positive there, put up pictures of the good times. There was thankfulness and trust between David and God. There was thankfulness in the small things that Eric Dane could no longer do anymore. He began to appreciate the small things in life that no longer cost, like listening to music and spending time with friends. David began to embrace desperate prayer, which connected him with God. He began to trust in this love and hung on to this relationship, this friendship, this security with God. Lastly, Mr. Dane says to fight. To fight. Not people, but the good fight. Fight to preserve, fight to hold on. My last question for you today. If you had to paint the color of your mind's anatomy, what color would it be? Would it be gray? Would it be ambiguous? Or the absence of color? The longest book in the Bible, the Psalms, was written by someone who battled depression. One of the most infamous fights which hailed from the Bible, David and Goliath, was against someone who struggled with depression. If God thought enough about you back then to use one of his most powerful kings, a leader, as a representation of someone who struggled with sadness, he had you in mind today. He sees you. He knows you. He hears you. He will get you through. Remember David. Remember God and what he has done for you in the past. And remember yourself. The good times. The person who got through. As Isaiah 40:31 promises, renewed strength to those who wait on the Lord. Know he promised never to leave you and never to forsake you. For a little time he has hidden his face from you for a moment, but with everlasting kindness he will have mercy on you. David's final words in this expression of pain in Psalms 13, verse 5 through 6 states, "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praises, for has been good to me. Blessed are those who put their trust in him. May the Lord hear the voice of your weeping. May you trust in his unfailing love. May your heart rejoice in your salvation. May you sing the Lord's praises and know that even when it doesn't feel good, that He is indeed good. He hears, He knows, He delivers. It will be okay. God bless each of you.